Welcome to Science on Tap, Minocqua. Thanks for coming. My name is Susan Knight. I work up at University of Wisconsin-Madison Trout Lake Station. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, where the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. We started Science on Tap not to be a lecture, but to be an opportunity for you to learn a little something and then ask questions that you have. Hopefully you will have lots of questions tonight. Our partners in Science on Tap are UW Trout Lake Station, Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and our host, the Minocqua Brewing Company. And Science on Tap is largely supported with funds from the Brittingham Foundation at UW-Madison. So thanks so much to them. And we have 4 ways to watch Science on Tap. You can watch right here, as you all are right now, which is great. You can go over to the library and watch over there, where we live stream it at the Minocqua Public Library. You can watch it live streamed anywhere, as long as you've got a decent internet connection. And we also archive all of our programs so that you can watch them later. And not only do we have the whole program, but we also make a short 8 to 10 minute short video so that you can watch the highlights a little bit later. So anyway, our next Science on Tap will be November 1st, and our topic will be birds in the North Woods with Eric Anderson and Alan Haney of UW Stevens Point. But tonight we have sports injuries in youth athletics with Dr. David Bell. He's in the UW Department of Kinesiology and Athletic Training, Orthopedics, and Rehabilitation at UW-Madison. And Dr. Bell grew up in Brasstown, North Carolina, a little town on the tippy west end of North Carolina, close to the Great Smoky Mountains. And as so often happens to people entering college, he had no idea what he wanted to do, but he stumbled onto the athletic training program, and that really stuck. So he went on to earn a master's degree at University of Virginia, and then went back to University of North Carolina for his PhD. Dr. David Bell is an assistant professor, as I said, in the departments of Kinesiology, Orthopedics, and Rehabilitation at UW-Madison. And he teaches in the athletic training program and serves as the director of Wisconsin Injury and Sports Laboratory. He's always had an interest in knee injury prevention, and he's worked with so many athletes, he says, that have had an ACL tear, and he just wanted to help them try to avoid all that pain of surgery and pain of rehabilitation. Earlier this year, David and researchers from across campus won an award for a groundbreaking study examining whether more young people are focusing their efforts on excelling at a single sport instead of playing a variety through the seasons. Dr. Bell says the take-home message on that one is to make sure children are getting breaks in competition. Okay, so here's your trivia question for Dr. Bell tonight, or about Dr. Bell. Each year, Brasstown, his hometown, has an interesting New Year's Eve celebration. Now, you all know in New York, they have a big ball and they drop it at the stroke of midnight. What do you think they drop in Brasstown, North Carolina? All right, this is multiple choice. You get 3 choices. A frozen turkey, B, a live possum, or C, a canned ham. Do we have votes? Canned ham. Live possum. And I've seen the video, and if anybody wants to see the video of this event, email me, and I'll send you a link to the video. No animals were harmed in the making of this video. So anyway, thanks so much. I'll give you Dr. Bell.
Thanks. So if you want to sue Brasstown, North Carolina, it's actually too late. They've already been sued by PETA. They have a special exemption from the state to do the possum drop every year. However, the gas station in which the possum drop occurs over is for sale. And so if you would like to continue the tradition, you can go by that gas station. Yeah, Clay's Corner. So thank you for the very kind introduction, Susan. Like she said, I do operate the Wisconsin Injury and Sport Laboratory at UW-Madison. And in my research lab, we really have two different research lines. One that's focused on injury risk factor identification, so trying to figure out what predisposes people for injury and kids for injury and how we can prevent those from occurring. And then the second one, we really focus on the anterior cruciate ligament, and so we focus on after people have surgery, how can we then optimize rehabilitation, and then how can we make sure to mitigate the injury risk or re-injury risk after people have an ACL injury. And so, the topics tonight can be very broad, and so I'm more than happy to kind of talk about anything you want. If I don't know something, I will be more than happy to tell you that I don't know, but maybe I can find the answer out for you. So the thing I really want to talk about today, though, and kind of do my 20-minute spiel on here, is related to youth and sports specialization. University of Wisconsin, in the past couple of years, we've developed quite a reputation for our research on sports specialization. And I just want to read to you some anecdotes from people just like you. So first of all, do we have any parents in here whose kids played sports or maybe used to play sports? Do we have any coaches in here? All right, so we've got a lot of different people that this definitely applies to, right? And the great thing about this research is, this is really the Wisconsin idea, right? Most of these research questions and most of the research that I'm going to talk about here today have been driven because of people like you, right? I mean, everybody likes to play sports. And also, just another note, I am not here to try to kill sports either, right? I think that playing sports is absolutely wonderful. I think playing sports is a great way to maintain physical activity across your lifespan. One couple things that we know about playing sports, right? The more physically active you are as a kid, the more physically active you're going to be as an adult. And the more physically active you are across your lifespan, then that means the less likely it is that you're going to develop diseases associated with physical inactivity, right? So, for example, tons of cancers like breast cancer, right? Cardiovascular disease, dementia, so on and so forth. So if we can keep people healthy throughout the lifespan, then that's what we really want to do. The problem is that injury and musculoskeletal injury is one of the biggest reasons why people stop being physically active and quit sports and stop playing sports. And so if we can intervene in that somehow in some way, then I think that's a good thing. And hopefully what we're going to do is by the end of today, I'm going to try to give you some at least recommendations that you can take back to your teams or that you can take back to your families. So again, here's some things that we hear from people across the state, right? So our team's postseason has been negatively impacted each of the last 2 years by club sports injuries. I competed in 84 soccer games in my senior year. We can't get enough girls to play basketball at our school because of club volleyball. Right? Sports always make my job more difficult. It's probably an athletic trainer or maybe a physician, right? If my son doesn't play baseball in the fall, they won't let him play in the spring. And my daughter just wants to make her varsity team, right? So sports specialization back in the day, and before we get too far, we should actually talk about what sports specialization actually is. So there's no true or totally agreed upon definition, but the general idea with sports specialization is that it's playing one sport year-round, right, at the exclusion of other sports. And so that's kind of the general definition that people have been using. And so we've got a kind of a problem here with athletics. And Dr. James Andrews, who's a very famous orthopedic surgeon who's down in Alabama, he sees this a lot in his practice, right? So we have specialization and we have professionalization. So kids these days are doing more and more. We're building bigger and stronger athletes, right? And do we really have the design to hold those muscles and bones together? And also specialization, right? So for a variety of factors, kids are basically being asked to quit multiple sports to focus on one sport, right? And the idea being that the more you do this, the more you focus and you play one sport, in theory, this kind of leads to a neuromuscular imbalance, right? So if you're going to do soccer types activities over and over again, then you're going to overdevelop musculature associated with soccer, underdevelop other musculature, and does that then make you at risk of injury? We don't know about that yet, but we do know that, and we have some pretty good evidence from our lab that shows that specialization is related to injury. So we have this definition of sports specialization, and then the next thing we need to do is figure out a way to measure it. So now we have a definition. If we didn't have a definition, it's really hard to really begin to study something. So a couple of years ago, there was this great researcher, great surgeon, or I'm sorry, primary care physician down in Atlanta named Nehru Gianthi, and he actually did a lot of this hard work for us. He actually developed the scale so we can actually determine if people are specialized or not. So the problem is, if you ask most people, kids, right, are you a single sport athlete or are you a multi-sport athlete? 85% of those kids are going to say that they're a multi-sport athlete. But if you begin to ask more detailed questions, you can really get a better sense of, it's not really this dichotomous, yes, I'm specialized, no, I'm not specialized. It's really along this kind of scale. It's along a continuum. And so he developed a scale that was based off 3 questions. These have yes or no answers to them. So the first question being, have you ever quit a sport to focus on a different sport, like a focus? So I was a soccer player and I played basketball. I quit basketball so I could focus on soccer. So the yes or no. If you answer yes, you get a point. The second one would be, do you consider your primary sport more important than any of the other sports you play? Right, so yes or no to that one. And then the third question being, do you play or train in that sport more than 8 months out of the year? Yes or no. And so if you answer yes to all 3 of those questions, then you're classified, now we kind of know from the research, that we would classify you as a highly specialized athlete. If you answer yes to 2 of those, then you're moderately specialized. And if you answer yes to 0 or 1, then you're like a low-level specialization. Lowly specialized sounds kind of weird, so I try not to say that. But you kind of get the point, right? So anybody know where this idea of specialization came from? Anybody heard of this thing called the 10,000-hour rule? Yeah. Outliers is the book written by Malcolm Gladwell, right? But actually, the actual research was done like back in 1992 by this guy named Erickson. But it's basically this idea that if you play or do something, you can play the trumpet, you can play the tuba, you can dance, you can play sports. If you do this directed, focused practice for 10,000 hours, then you will then become an expert in that thing, right? Which sounds great, and maybe that works in something where we're sitting, like we can do some research, we can do that for 10,000 hours, right? Check, I'm an expert. We can play the violin, we can play the piano. The only problem is if we're asking like our 10-year-olds to start to do that in order to get a college scholarship, right? The math doesn't really work out well for us. Basically, you would have to do deliberate practice in your sport 3 hours a day, 365 days a year. I think the math was for about 14 years or so, right? So, a 10-year-old, now you're 25. Even if it was 10 years, right, you're still kind of mixing up those bounds. And no one is going to ask an 8-year-old, well, we shouldn't be asking an 8-year-old to play sports or to practice soccer 3 hours a day, 365 days a year. And yet, we're getting reports, and we talk to people every day we go out into the community about just these things, right? We hear about 10-year-olds and 8-year-olds basically being forced to specialize in a single sport or to lose their roster spot and not be able to participate in their sport anymore. Right, so the 10,000-hour rule is really about motor development, right? And so what we've done at Wisconsin, I just want to share like one research study with you that we've done recently. In 2015 to 2016 academic year, we surveyed and prospectively followed, right? So we went out to these schools, we tested these athletes, had them fill out the survey, classified them into a specialization category, and then followed them throughout their sports season. So we enrolled 1,500 Wisconsinites, right? And we had athletic trainers basically follow them throughout their season. They recorded every athlete exposure that every time a kid practiced or played in a game, and they also recorded all of their injuries. And what we found was that if you looked at those low specialization kids and those moderate specialization kids, right, there was about a 50% increase in the number of injuries that those kids had. If you looked at the low specialization kids and you compared them to those high specialization kids, there was about an 85% increase in the number of injuries that they had. And we were able to control for all those factors, like how much sports people were playing, or how many exposures they had, for example, how many we could control for like their previous injury history, stuff like that. And so what we found was that this was the first kind of large-scale study that really directly tied in a prospective manner, which was a really stronger study design, about linking specialization and injury risk. And so a couple of years earlier, what we were able to do was also look at some of these recommendations that are out there. And that's really kind of one of the last things I kind of want to talk about in my kind of 15-minute, 20-minute intro here are about some of the recommendations that are out there for parents and for coaches and for whomever. The first one is to delay specialization, right? So you want to delay sports specialization really as long as you can. Ideally, we'd wait until someone was like, 15 or 16. If we have to wait until freshman year of high school, then that's okay too, just as long as we basically possibly can. The other recommendation that you hear about, and has anyone in here, just maybe a show of hands, of how many people have heard of recommendations related to the months per year before tonight that kids should play sports? Anybody? One person, right? Thanks for coming back. So we had one person, and that is actually not surprising, right? So we know that about 80%, 85% of people don't know that these recommendations exist. Oftentimes what we kind of tell ourselves in my lab, right, is like, so do people know about these things, or are we just talking to ourselves? And yes, we are pretty much talking to ourselves, except when we come out to events like this and try to talk to you guys, right? So the recommendations right now, Dr. Andrews would say the same thing, is we really want people and parents and real kids to have at least 3 to 4 months off per year. They don't have to be consecutive, right? So for example, you could play football, make sure you try to get a month off, right? Then play basketball, try to get a month off. Then play baseball in the spring, and then try to take another month off. We know that sometimes that's not realistic, especially sometimes in smaller communities, right? Where I was the athletic trainer for a very small school in Kentucky. And so, my first job out of college, and I thought I was doing pretty great, was getting people through football season. And it's like, all right, well, as soon as this football season is over, you'll get a break. And then as soon as that Saturday or Friday night football ended, Monday morning I walk out there and there's that kid playing basketball, right? It's like, okay, we should have, given that kid a little bit more of a break while he could, because now he's turning around and playing a different sport. That's okay from a specialization standpoint to play different sports. But the problem that we're also seeing is that the typical specialization athlete here in Wisconsin, for example, is going to be like a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old female soccer player. All right, so she's going to play club soccer during the summer, and then she's going to possibly play some club. She might, for example, run cross country with her school team, and then during the weekdays or evenings, and then in the weekends, she's going to play club soccer 2 or 3 times a week and tournaments on the weekend. And then during basketball season, she might play basketball, right? But she's still going to go play club soccer, and she's really a soccer athlete. Right? And then in the spring, she'll play for her school and not play club, but she's still playing soccer. And in essence, she's training for soccer, even though she has some different sports activities that she's doing. So in that case, we're really worried about volume in her, right? So the second recommendation is something we call hours per week related to your age. So that basically says that kids who are playing sports should play about the number of hours per week of organized sports related to their age. So if we have that 13-year-old soccer player, right, she should be playing about 13 hours per week of organized soccer and or, strength training, for example, that are directly related to soccer. And if she went up to 16 or 17 in an off week, I wouldn't be too worried about that. But the problem is, when you talk to our pediatricians, they have kids that are playing 30 hours during the school year, and they're playing 40 during the summer, right? Because now they have unlimited time to actually participate. And so one of the questions that our pediatricians often ask is, okay, let's just sit down here as a group here and figure out how many hours per week your kids are doing activity, right? And so they start on one hand, right? And then they start on the second hand, and then they add in the right foot, right? And then they add in the left foot, and then the parents' eyes kind of start getting really big, right? And that's kind of the point, right? That they just need some awareness and education to understand that all this, pounding that you're putting on your lower extremity is related to the stress fracture that you're in there to see the pediatrician for. So hours per week related to your age. The other one there about hours per week is around 16 for different sports. So those are the big ones. And I've got a lot more here that I can talk about, but if I was going to do kind of a take-home point for you guys here, it's making sure that if you're the parent or you're a coach, like I think one of the big breakdown in communication is between club sports and school sports, right? So maybe you guys here in Minocqua are a little bit insulated to that because you are a smaller community, and maybe I'm not sure about the access to club sports, but in a place like Madison or Milwaukee or Appleton, club sports are a very big deal, and there's a big disconnect between what the clubs do and what parents do and what kids actually are doing. And so, there's this big communication breakdown, and and unfortunately, a lot of this does fall on the parents because the parents are kind of the ultimate arbiters here of their child's schedule, right? And so they might need to say, maybe we need to take a little break here from this particular practice in order to make sure that you're doing things safely. The other thing, though, is that this is risk. And inherently, people have a difficulty understanding risk, right? So when I drive back to Madison tomorrow, right, and I'm leaving in the morning, and I've got my cup of coffee, and I'm listening to something on the radio, and I'm trying to eat food at the same time, and I'm going a little bit faster, right? I'm going over the speed limit. Like, all of those things attribute to risk. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to get injured and have a car accident just because I did those activities. And that's the same thing. It elevates your risk of sustaining an injury, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get injured. But I've had lots of people sitting in my office telling me, oh, Dr. Bell, like, this really begins to make sense because when I got injured playing football in high school, I thought it was because I wasn't strong enough, and I needed to work out more. So I would work out in the morning, I'd play football in the afternoon, and go to a football practice, and then after practice, I would go lift a little bit more. He's like, and actually, what I might needed to have done was like take a little break and maybe only go lift 3 days a week or something like that, right? So, so that's it for my kind of introductory spiel here. And I think that hopefully you guys have some Q&A. I've got a lot more I can talk about, but I'd love to make it more directly related to whatever you guys are interested in as well.
In that hours per week formula, is there a limit to the age that applies? In other words, at my age, can I do that many hours of...
I see where you're going. Yeah. Go crazy, right? No, we would usually worry about that in, people that are skeletally immature, for example, right? As we get older, we have a whole multitude of other issues that we have to worry about that aren't necessarily sport-related, but could be. But yeah, it's usually not the pounding. It's usually the result of the pounding that our lower extremities took earlier in life that are now leading to some of those issues, like osteoarthritis, for example. Yeah. And we don't just have to talk about sport specialization, and we can talk about lots of things.
Can you define what you mean by month off? Like, are you talking limited to no physical activity? Are you talking about not sport specific? Are you talking about, like, I guess my question is, let's say that you have a kid who's a wrestler.
Yep.
Okay? Hypothetically.
Yep.
All right?
Yep, sure.
Thank you for the local coaches laughing. But if you want that kid to lift, can they still lift at an intense high level, or is that then counterproductive? So can you define that idea of what it means for time off for a kid who is a multi-sport athlete?
So, yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think what we're talking about here, for example, is We don't want people to be couch potatoes, right? So we don't want them to just sit there and do absolutely nothing. I think, the idea of active rest is perfectly acceptable, right? So that person could, you could even do some cross-training during that period, right? If they were a wrestler, maybe have them go swimming. It always gets a little weird when you take swimmers and you put them on land, right? That's usually when they get hurt. So, for what that's worth, right? So some sort of cross-training, high-intensity lifting, I don't know about, there are benefits to that, though. Certainly, we want people to be strong in order to kind of maximize injury prevention if we can, but you just have to make sure that you're kind of doing it smartly. We don't have great guidelines, but I think kind of active rest would be good, cross-training would be okay, but I think a good way to think of this is like, if you're trying to give information to someone, I think you want, if you were playing sports, right, high days can be high days, and that's perfectly okay. Like low days should be low days, not low days and then heading to another sport to do something else days, right? And off days really should be off days, right? I think we get into a lot of trouble with club teams. When I talk to club coaches, I actually think that they're not the problem here. I think overall they're actually being relatively reasonable. The problem is there are breakdowns in the communication, right? So if a kid's participating in school soccer and it's their off day, it should truly be an off day. They shouldn't go to club softball practice during that time period, even though that might be okay, but they shouldn't go to club soccer practice that day, right? So they can truly have an off day and a rest day. We're getting really good at building bigger athletes and better athletes. The engines that we can put it, that'd be the first time that someone fell at Science on Tap. Recorded for prosperity, right? I think we're getting really good at putting engines in kids, right? We're getting good at strength training. We know how to make kids bigger and stronger and faster. The problem is we're not getting any better at putting brakes in kids, right? Our ligaments are kind of our ligaments. And for the most part, that means that those are the things that can absorb and are the weak link in the chain and that can end up breaking. Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So you and I could probably have a conversation for a long time tonight about some things because this is kind of my deal as far as multi-sport athletes. But I guess one of the things I wanted to maybe talk about or bring up is the Erickson study in the 10,000-hour rule and a couple flaws in that study that maybe people aren't aware of as a result revolves around athletics, and that is that the first part of the study was musicians.
Yep.
And so it had nothing to do with athletics. It was musicians. And the second thing about it was that these people were already elite, talented musicians, and so they were reflecting back on what they thought they had done to get to that point.
Yep.
And so there really is no empirical evidence about that 10,000-hour rule.
No, and I think the only reason that anything came of that was because of Malcolm Gladwell's book that really kind of popularized that idea and that notion. But you're right. I mean, I can think back to my high school, right? And I can think back, and I'm sure many of you can reflect on this now, like there was always that just absolutely crazy athletic person. And we all knew as kids that kid always had a roster spot on any team he wanted to come out for, right? Or she, whomever, right? Because they were just an incredibly gifted athlete, right? And so the problem here that we're also seeing with specialization is genetics, right? For example, the same thing with some of these, there's some studies coming out now that are basically looking at having, for example, D1 athletes. We did this with our Badger athletes where we had them basically go out and retrospectively fill out the sport specialization scale. Well, like less than 50% of those athletes were actually highly specialized, but they were all really good athletes, right? And so they had that kind of genetic gift in order to be able to make a roster spot. The problem, and I think where a lot of people are falling into this, is that most people aren't going to make those roster spots, right? There are less people that have that kind of natural athletic talent that are not gifted. And so here's another anecdote from a coworker of mine whose daughter went to try out for a club volleyball team. So she had played in high school, right, and was trying out for a club travel team in volleyball. And they kind of put all the good girls, right, the really gifted people that were on the varsity team, they put those on like kind of like the first travel team, and then they had the second travel team that came up, and that's where her daughter ended up. And they also had several girls who couldn't even make the varsity, or couldn't even make like maybe I don't think it was freshman team, but like kind of the JV team, for example, of the team. And they got absolutely killed in every game that they played because it wasn't any fun. And, and sometimes the hard truth about club spots and club teams is like they'll always have as many roster spots as for people that are willing to pay for that particular outlet, because club sports is a business. Yeah, so I totally agree with you on that. Can't fight genetics sometimes, right? Yeah.
Yeah, doctor. You're
call me
talking
Dave.
about you make recommendations. Do you ever make recommendations to WIAA?
So one of the researchers that we work with does a lot with WIAA. I actually think the WIAA does a very reasonable job in terms of that. There aren't recommendations right now from the National Federation of High School level about hours per week or months per year. And in fact, anecdotally, things are starting to go the other way. For example, if I'm remembering the story correctly, in Arizona is actually doing away with basically any sports season. So if you want to do football, you can do football 365 days, or 180 days out of the year in your high school. So you'll have your normal contact football season, and then you can basically do like 7-on-7 the rest of the time. So that, in essence, they're going to have highly specialized athletes in football as a result of that. And in Wisconsin, that's not really the case because it's usually a very finite period of time. Football is the one that we still don't see a whole lot, at least in Wisconsin. People in Texas tell me that's very different, right? And they love to tell me that it's very different, and I believe them. But they tell me that football is different in Texas, right? And that you can definitely specialize in football if you want to. In Wisconsin, we don't really have that, although it's probably headed that way to some degree.
I got one other question.
Yeah.
It has to do with three different things. Number one, turf fields.
Okay.
We just got one here.
Okay.
Injuries on turf fields,
Okay.
worse, more, whatever. The next thing is coaches that play in high school quite a bit, same players both ways. I know one team now, it's got 30 players on it. He rarely plays a junior, never a sophomore, but he's playing seniors, 8 of them, both ways out of 11 people on the offense or defense.
Okay.
Is there any rules or regulations on that? Because kids are getting hurt and beat up and bad knees, and you're talking about knees.
Yep. So let me take the first two here.
Yeah.
Okay. So thankfully, Susan gave me a heads up on this, and actually I taught a class today, right? And Susan, I didn't tell you this, but I took your email and I put it up on my board and said, here in this course is like kind of, don't tell the students this, but it can be hard to teach because it can be a little bit dry, like research and athletic training, right? So I try to do everything I can to make it somewhat exciting for the students. And so this is like a real life example, right? We have people that say, man, we just installed this artificial turf field, right? And we're seeing increase in injury rates. Is that just us? Or does the research support that artificial turf fields have increased injury rates and or worse severity of injuries as a result? So we were able to look this up beforehand just to make sure that what I knew a couple years ago was still the case, and it's still pretty much the case, that in these third generation infill artificial turf fields, there's really no difference in injury rates compared to grass. They're pretty much similar. Unfortunately, that's probably not what some of the coaches want to hear. Sometimes teams just get snake bit a little bit by injuries, and it's kind of regression to the mean, right? So some years you're injury free, and some years you have a big spike in injuries. Unfortunately, what the research shows, well, or I guess fortunately or unfortunately, doesn't matter, right? What the research shows is that there's really no difference in injury rates between grass and these third generation artificial turf fields. And that's looking at the totality. Now you could go out and you could find an article that says different, but if you look at these kind of more systematic reviews that are kind of bigger picture, that kind of take in all of the different studies that are available, as well as the quality of the studies, they're pretty much equal. And then and then playing both ways. I mean, from an epidemiological standpoint, those kids are going to accumulate more hours of football, and so they're at higher risk, period. And I don't really know what else the research says about that, but that's a reality in a lot of smaller schools and smaller communities. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of a two-part question. The first, so you already said we're creating bigger, faster, stronger athletes at the elite level. We're seeing, records broken across the board, but how many average people are getting beat to hell because of that? So you're putting all these people through the same thing, and there are those genetically gifted people that are naturally going to rise to the top and for some reason are able to fend off or fight off the injuries that come from too many hours, too much participation. But you see a lot of other people who are just dog tired and have chronic overuse injuries because they're trying to compete at the same level as someone whose body can just take it, handle it.
Right. So I'll answer that, I guess.
Well, just to preface, in a small community, right, you have a few of those genetically gifted and many more not so much.
In reality, right, every community is like that, right? I mean, you get this kind of nice bell-shaped curve, right, where you're going to have a few people. Anybody know, for example, what percentage of high school kids actually earn a Division I college scholarship? We got 5%. Anybody want to say something different? 2%? You're right, and it's actually a little bit lower. So if you look at NCAA football, right, it's going to be like 1.5, 1.8% of kids are actually going to go on to earn a college scholarship. And that's across the board. So you think football, there's a lot of people that play football, right? And there's a lot more NFL teams and there's a lot more college teams, but the numbers pretty much bear that out. It's a pretty small proportion that actually end up going on and going and advancing to the next level. So that's also something that we've surveyed parents about, and I'll get back to your question in a second. I'm going to kind of go off on a tangent here. There was actually a study that just came out that showed that in some households, people are spending up to $1,000 per kid per month on sports-related expenses, right? And so those are people that are on travel teams, right? And we have surveyed parents from Wisconsin and seen the same things, where some parents are spending upwards of $30,000 on their kids' sports activities. And this is the tough part too, because how do you determine the kid who's going to make it versus the kid who's not going to make it? It's a risk versus reward kind of balance, right? The risk is injury, severe injury maybe, right? The reward is millions of dollars of an NFL contract, right? Or an NBA contract, right? So the reward really outweighs the risk to probably a lot of people. But the other thing is too, hey, maybe save your money, spend half of that amount of money, and then you can put the other part in your kid's college fund, right? And you can send your kid to wherever they want to go to college pretty easily, probably at that point, certainly in state anyway, right? So the second part of your question is kind of more related to training. How do we kind of figure this out, right? So the question is, the answer right now is that we don't have a great sense of actually how to do that. And a lot of it, we're relying on expertise of coaches, right? And people in the community to make sure that they're putting the kids through an appropriate amount of, high days and low days and rest days, and that they're putting people through enough sport-specific activities that can protect those kids. But, like I said, 85% of people don't know of any of the recommendations that I've just told you, right? So maybe that's a starting point for some of those kids, right? If you have a kid, if you're an athletic trainer, or, or you see someone that maybe has a stress fracture, just starting to figure out the number of hours per day that they're doing activity is a pretty good start anyway, and at least it's a conversation starter. Because we haven't even started talking about, for example, like dance, right? That can pound your lower extremities as much as playing soccer can, right? So, and people are usually doing dance for very long periods during the day as well.
So another sort of piece of this question, kind of a lot of the research you've been doing focuses on specialization and hours of training. A problem we have in this community also is so there's a lot of football coaches here from Lakeland tonight. What percentage do you think, if you had to say, of kids that just they're year-round athletes between hockey, football, and everything else, are just nonstop like working out and training? What would you say if you had to? Like for football, for example, it's a small top percentage, right? It's very small. But we do see that fatigue and that overtraining happening there. And we have almost an opposite problem where there's essentially no training until like the first day of the season. And two, so obviously we're at risk for overtraining injuries just from that increased pounding from no pounding, but also acute injuries because there's weakness. I mean, have you looked at any of that at all?
So we haven't specifically. We're starting to a little bit. One of my doc students is a strength and conditioning, has a strength and conditioning background, and he's really interested in training load and how do you mitigate injury risk with training load. The best information we have at the moment is really from some Australian studies and studies in New Zealand that are related to training load, where they kind of put the GPS monitors right on high-level soccer teams and rugby teams and stuff like that. And the research does show that a gradual rise in training load over time is one of the better things that you can do to mitigate injury risk. Although that's sometimes really hard to do, especially in a high school season where you have a relatively finite period of time. And these are professional soccer players, right? We have no clue if these recommendations hold in high school freshmen, right, that are playing football.
Well, they might, but how do you get a kid to follow?
Well, and the other thing is looking at, for example, we also know that there needs to be, for example, a minimum amount of training that a kid person needs to have in order to mitigate injury risk. So like it kind of follows you, right? The worst thing that you can almost do is have like a really high day and then an off day, and then a really high day and then a really off day in terms of training load. What you'd rather have is kind of like a moving average of something relatively stationary training load. So you might have a high day, but then needs to be followed by a somewhat lower training load day, but not a total off day, right? So you'll see that teams do that sometimes, where if they have a game, all the starters get a break, right, because they've had a game, but everybody who didn't get in has to go run some sprints. And the reason that they do that is in order to maintain their, what they call acute to chronic training load level. And there's a ratio that's kind of ideal in some of these field sports. We don't know anything about American football, right? This is more like rugby players and soccer players. So again, ideally, if you could ramp it up, and then also, don't have these big seesaw patterns in training. Try to have more of a consistent training load. Yeah.
Hey, I had a three-part question, and it might be very subjective, but out of all the sports that are offered to adolescents and teens and preteens today in this area, what are the percentages as far as at-risk and long-term recovery? Then, my second part of the question is, when a child chooses to become specialized, when do you as a parent or a caregiver let them push themselves to that level past what would be just in a club or whatnot? And then my last part is, you would mention something about that minimum level as far as creating a risk to injury. Is there also other sports that can correlate with helping them avoid having injuries in the specialized sport that they want to pursue later on in college?
Okay, I'm probably going to need some help, but I'm going to go back to number one, and let me answer that one, and then we can kind of take those as you help me through them. All right, so number one, so injuries are definitely going to be somewhat sport specific, right? So we know that, for example, soccer and basketball, Those are primarily lower extremity sports. You're going to be more likely to have an ankle or a knee injury in those different sports. Both of those are, relatively contact related, so your concussion is also going to be a risk for those different sports. And with a lot of those, it's related to exposure. So the more you play, the more it is likely that you're gonna have an injury. Does that answer your question? So it's very sport specific. Wrestling, it's upper body, it's lower body. You're going to have tons of shoulders. You're going to have tons of lower extremity injuries. Swimming, like I said, most of the time that's going to be, you're going to have more chronic overuse injuries in that sport. And unless they're going around running outside, then that's when they get the lower extremity ankle. Yeah. Oh, football, everything. Right, so concussions are certainly a big concern. Depending on what kind of injuries, you can have a lot of non-contact injuries, but a lot of those injuries are going to be contact, right? And sometimes there's nothing you can really do about those injuries, right? So if someone's in a pile and they get rolled up on, there's not a whole lot you can do to prevent that knee from giving way or that ankle from kind of rolling. There are definitely males. We saw, who's the Minnesota running back, Dalvin Cook, right? He just had from like a ACL researcher standpoint, it was a beautiful non-contact ACL injury mechanism. It was absolutely classic. It's not good for him, right? Because he's going to miss the rest of his season. But those kind of injuries do definitely occur in football. You see a little bit, pretty much of everything. Part 2.
Are there different sports that will help correlate condition in a young child or young adult's body so that they won't have as much injury, especially if they're going to be doing it on contact sport like soccer?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to say. I would say probably not. I would think that, first of all, you have risk factors that are inherent to a person, right? And there's nothing that you can do about those that are, for example, anatomical in nature, right? For example, we know that how big someone's notch in their knee where their ACL sits is a risk factor for ACL injury, but no one's going to go in and do a prophylactic knee surgery to widen that notch to make sure that no one tears their ACL, right? It's just not going to happen. And I think the one thing you want to do if you're a parent is really the number one reason why kids play sports, right, is because they want to have fun and they're having fun doing it. And the number one reason why kids drop out of sport is because they're not having fun anymore, right? And so as long as the kid's having fun, like, I don't want people to leave here so worried about injury, right, that they have to wrap their kid in bubble wrap to have them cross the street, right? There's so many great aspects of sport. Like, I don't want to, if you're getting that point, like, I'm not here to scare you. I'm just here to tell you about some of the realities of it, right? Like I said, I want kids to play sport. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's wonderful if it's right for them, right? And as long as they're having fun doing it, there are so many positive aspects. Why not play sports, right? And what was number 3?
About what age would you let a child choose to be specialized in one sport? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so what age would you want a child to specialize if you had to choose at that point? So the answer is it depends, but as long as possible. If they're a freshman in high school and they're starting to specialize, that's okay. Ideally 15 to 16 would be ideal, but a lot of the ships, it depends on the sport too, right? If you have a gymnast and you think that they have a chance at making the elite level, well, they have to specialize a lot earlier, right? Tennis players are the same thing, right? National elite tennis players are like, 5 years old or something, right? They're not that young, right? But you get kind of the point. Other sports, for example, like long distance running, you don't even need to specialize until you're way into high school. If you go back and you look at the New York City Marathon and what age the finishers are, they're all like 28, 29, 35-year-old folks. So it really depends on the sport, right? There's some sports where early specialization is probably actually needed if you have a chance. But again, most people don't have a chance, but who am I to quash the dreams of a 12-year-old girl, right? Or a 14-year-old boy. And But yeah, if you're a longer distance runner, then you can wait a long time before you actually specialize in that sport. You're not going to peak. You're not going to be really good until a lot later anyway. Yeah.
All right. Speaking specifically with the ACL, can you give us some statistics, I guess, on whether or not that specific injury, the tear of the ACL or the strain of the ACL, if that's increased, and if so, at what rate?
Yep. I can definitely talk about that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
And then after
I'm ready to go.
after you do that, I have another question then.
Okay, so let's talk about primary injuries. So that's like the first time someone tears their ACL, right? So we know those sports are going to be soccer, basketball. Females are going to be more likely to tear their ACL compared to men in match sports. And females are more likely to tear their ACL in a non-contact manner, non-contact mechanism. So there's no one around them. They do a cut, right, that they've done 1,000 times before, and their ACL snaps, gives way, and it's ruptured. So females are going to be somewhere between 2 and 8, 4 and 6 times more likely compared to males to tear an ACL. So that's a problem. We know that ACL injury prevention programs work. We also know that no one does them, and if they do them, they do them incorrectly. So we're not helping ourselves out in that manner. So a buddy of mine at Oregon State, he asked people, do you do an ACL injury prevention program as part of your dynamic warm-up for your soccer team? Yep, absolutely we do. He went out and observed them. Everybody did them wrong, right? They had modified them, so they were basically useless at that point. They don't take away the risk in total. They basically decrease the amount of injuries that you would have by about half. So they reduce the rate by about 50%. So if you have 3 ACLs, man, wouldn't it be nice if you had 1, right? The problem is you don't know that you had the other 2, right? If you're doing the injury prevention program. The problem so are ACLs increasing? The answer is yes. Over the past 20 years, surgery rates in that young cohort, 14 to 18 years of age, have really skyrocketed, actually. So again, we're getting a lot better at putting engines in people, but our brakes are exactly the same. And so the ACL is kind of paying the price for part of that. Now, part of that also might be the large volume of activity that people are actually doing as well. And then the other problem that we have with ACL injuries are second ACL injury rates. So if you tear one ACL, right, you're now a really high-risk individual. You are basically 16 times more likely to either re-tear or to tear your opposite leg if you go back and play sports. Almost just as alarming is that about 50% of people who tear their ACL don't go back and play sports. So they just exit altogether because they're like, hey, I'm going to have the surgery, I'm going to go back, I'm going to play sports, and then they actually have the surgery, they do 9 months of rehab, and they're like, man, I really do not want to go through that again, and so they stop, right, and they don't go back and they don't play soccer. We don't know if they go back and do some other form of activity. We also know that those people who tore one ACL benefit the most from injury prevention programs, but they still don't do them, and if they do them, they do them incorrectly. So we've got a couple different problems there related to second ACL injuries. Yeah, so about 30% are going to re-tear.
And then can you correlate kind of those statistics then with the specialized athletes compared to those who are multi-sport?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's really easy. We have no clue that if specialization results in injury rates. There's a lot of talk about that. I mean, I sit in these conferences with these physicians and with other researchers related to ACL injuries, right? And they sit there and they were like, well, so why are these ACL injury rates increasing? And I would bet $5 on it that someone's going to say sports specialization, and everybody's like, that sounds logical, right? I mean, that really seems to make sense. But unfortunately, the numbers just first of all, no one's done a study that specifically have looked at that. The problem is that ACL injuries are still pretty rare, and so the problem is you would need to enroll thousands upon thousands of people in order to get enough ACL injuries in order to really answer that question. So it would be like a $5 million study probably from the NIH in order to answer that specific question. Our research that we looked at, the study that I cited before, we saw that nice stair-step progression related to overuse and gradual onset injuries. When we looked at acute injuries, those three, the low, the moderate, and the high, were all basically right next to each other. So specialization wasn't really increasing acute injury risk. It was just the overuse side of things. And we classify ACL as an acute injury. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, you kind of answered part of this already because you said ACLs are not that common as far as injuries, especially in high school, or is it across high school, college, pro? And then the second part I would say with that is, as a head coach, I like how you kind of jokingly say that we have no idea what to do with ACL and ACL prevention, but I'll tell you that I'm very confident if you were to ask me about concussion protocol, return to play, symptoms, diagnosis, potential for all those kind of pieces, because it's been thrown down our throats. We're hit on it yearly, all of those pieces. Is it because concussions are so much more frequent that we have more of that? Because I would tell you that if I had seen it, it might be something that we can incorporate, but I've never seen anything related to an ACL prevention. So.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of literature out there related to ACL injury prevention. I mean, a lot of the dynamic warm-ups that soccer teams do now those are really designed from like a research impetus of what works in ACL injury prevention. They're designed to be these programs that basically take the place of your warm-up or are your warm-up, right? And they definitely are effective. But you're right, in terms of concussions, the concussion bell has been rung, no pun intended, right? A couple people got that, right? A little more subtle joke, right? So the concussion bell, I mean, it's definitely out there, right? I mean, it is also a much more litigious issue. People are much more quick to sue about concussions because it's your brain, and we still don't know so much about the brain that people are trying to really protect themselves a lot more from a concussion standpoint than from an ACL standpoint. It wouldn't surprise me someday if someone got sued, like a soccer coach got sued because they didn't do some sort of dynamic warm-up and injury prevention program. I mean, I'll tell you that the teams that I go out to and I see around Madison, they're all doing some sort of dynamic warm-up, but they're doing it half-heartedly, right? They're not doing it necessarily correctly. That really has to be ingrained from a team culture standpoint in order to do those.
So following up real quick,
Yeah.
explain, because you do have a significant number of coaches here.
Yeah.
Can you give a little bit more on dynamic warm-up and what some of the things that we can do to do it well and to do it correctly?
Yeah, so the question is related to the dynamic warm-up. What information is out there? Where can we find it to get a little bit more information about it? So the FIFA 11 Plus program is the one that's soccer specific, that's related to, that a lot of research has been done to show that that's an effective warm-up. That's what all the European soccer leagues are going to do as part of their warm-up. It's basically has some plyometrics in it. It basically has some movement, proper movement techniques built into it. So for example, like doing squats, keeping your knees over your toes, right? Work with lateral band work, for example, kind of doing some running and sprinting and making sure that you're in the proper position. The FIFA 11, for some reason, they took the website down, but there is another website that's popped up to replace it that actually has the program kind of laid out. And there are 3 different ones that kind of give you 3 different options that are available. But I'm more than happy to also give you that information too. Yep.
Professional sports, particularly football and basketball, it seems like there are quite a few ACL injuries. And at worst, these athletes maybe will miss a season, but then they'll come back. And I guess my question is, are their coaches or agents aware of the statistics about recurring injuries once you've had an ACL? And are they just blinded by the financial incentive to come back?
Yeah, so I don't. I'm sure that their medical staff is probably giving them some information related to second ACL injury rates. So a couple years ago, remember that guy named Adrian Peterson, right? He tore his ACL, and if you're a Packer fan, that was, you were probably conflicted with that. You hate to see a guy get injured, right? But it's a Minnesota Viking, right? No. Maybe this is too close to Minnesota right now. So anyway, he actually made ACL researchers' life really difficult because remember what happened the season after he came back? He had a record-setting season, right? So everybody that tore their ACL thought, hot dog, right? I'm gonna have a record-setting season. I'm gonna kill this rehab. This is gonna be great, right? This is gonna be okay. It's gonna stink, but I'm gonna come back better than ever. His injury, I think, was a little simple, right? He just tore his ACL. And so not all injuries to the ACL are just to the ACL. Only about 30% of people who tear their ACL just tear the ACL alone. The other 70% have some sort of what we call concomitant issue with it. So they're going to tear their meniscus or their MCL. Ever heard of the other guy, RG3, right? Yeah. So he had, that was his second ACL tear. This is kind of his last one. But he also had like a posterior lateral corner tear as part of that. And that is like one of the toughest things that you can deal with as an orthopedic surgeon. At least that's what they tell me. I'm certainly not an orthopedic surgeon. But I was talking to my friend who was a Washington fan, right? And he was saying, oh, but it's just an ACL. Look at Adrian Peterson and look how great he did, right? And the question, and I was like, it's not the same thing, and his outcome was much worse as a result of it. So not all ACLs are equal to all ACLs. I'm sure that they're kind of given some of that information, but the problem is, you hear about people nowadays who are quitting football because of their repetitive brain trauma, maybe because of the number of concussions, and they're really worried about their long-term status in life. People seem less worried about if they tear their ACL again, even though we know when we go interview Division I athletes 30 years after they're stopped playing, they have significant issues with just how their injuries have impact their function in their daily living.
Yeah, if you can come up with a link to that ACL prevention warm-up or whatever, I'll post it on our Science on Tap website, then I'll make it available through Don. Okay?
I'll do it.
Any other questions?
Have there been any studies, or do you recommend any type of extra equipment that athletes can wear? Shoes? I wear compression leggings sometimes when I do various athletics, especially the ones that have the reinforced gussets at the joints.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, let's talk about that because that's a great question. Yeah, so braces, for example, ankle braces work great to prevent ankle sprains and ankle injuries. Work from one of my colleagues, Tim McWine. He did a great study, again, in high school Wisconsinites that basically showed that ankle braces are really effective at preventing injuries. If you're a football player and you wear knee braces, that research is, again, very, very mixed. It's not clear that there's a benefit from wearing from knee braces, especially like linemen, right? We see this even in our Badger athletes about preventing injuries. You can cherry pick some studies, but overall, it's really unclear whether there's a benefit there or not. Compression garments, there was a study that just came out on compression garments and showed that didn't really have any effect on the athlete's performance whatsoever. So those were kind of like, I think this was a running economy study where they had people in kind of those compression tights and looked at them, and there was really no difference in how people actually performed wearing those. The problem is with a lot of these products, the products and industry is always going to move faster than the science will be to actually catch up with them. So people can put a lot of money into things that might not work. Couple new things that we've seen. One is that, for example, in youth kids flag football or in 7-on-7 football, people will put on those padded helmets. Anybody seen those? Yeah, so it's supposed to be non-contact, flag football or whatever. I mean, no one has done any research on that, but those are $70 a pop, and they're asking people that you have to have your kids wear this. Again, I think it's more of like a litigious issue. I don't think that is doing anything to prevent the brain from sloshing around in the skull. And in fact, if we think about like what football helmets were originally intended for, right, it wasn't concussion at all, it's skull fracture, right? And they do an absolutely fantastic job at what they were originally intended to do, which was prevent skull fracture. But there's no such thing as a concussion-proof helmet. You can buy the $450 helmet, or you can buy the $200 helmet, and they both give you currently the same amount of concussion protection, which is basically very little to zero. And then the other thing that we're also seeing is the soccer headbands, especially requires, we'll see this a lot in girls teams, club teams. They're required to wear those. Again, my colleague Tim McGuine is doing a research study on looking at concussion rates in those headgear, in those soccer headgears, because again, those are like $40 a pop that they're asking people to pay for them. And I don't know the results of that study, but I would be shocked if he found that those were effective at decreasing concussion rates. But again, to be determined on that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious on your opinion with resistance training and I guess the harm versus help, and specifically, I guess, to age at which you would think resistance training is beneficial to begin, types of possibly resistance training that you would recommend in injury prevention versus potentially even creating a high risk for injury depending on what they're doing?
Gosh, this is a great question. I almost brought my doc student who does strength training stuff up here because he's probably much better suited to answer that question than I am, especially in those like skeletally immature athletes, people that have growth plates open. I think most people who are kind of, in sports medicine would say like, man, muscles are the things that help stabilize the joint. And so having strong muscles is always going to be a good thing. But having someone who has the proper training and the proper certification and the proper experience to guide your youth athlete through that process is really one of the key components. And strength training is certainly going through that right now, trying to figure out like what certification is appropriate for them, and how they can kind of deal with some of the risks of training athletes, because you want to push athletes as hard as you can, but I know I'm not really answering your question, but I'm going to say that I'm going to punt on it because I don't feel quite qualified to answer that about skeletally immature athletes. I know that some is going to be okay, right? But heavy loading, heavy lifting, and what percentage is accurate and when's a good age to start, I just don't quite have that information available to me at the moment. So I'd rather say I don't know and just be honest rather than try to make something up.